I would like to invite again Jonathon Wright. He will have the first lab of the day, Agentic AI, a hands-on workshop on large action models, chain of thought, prompt threading, and knowledge graphs. That's for you again, Jonathon.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate the whistle there. I think that was some good work. So this is going to be interesting. It's a lab. I don't have a machine in front of me, so I know people over the break asked me, "Are we doing this with laptops?" If you have laptops, then we'll try our best to make this work. I'm not quite sure what version of this slides are, so I'm going to take it as we go. But yeah, I think part of what I really wanted to do, I'm going to say before lunch, BL for an abbreviation thrown out there early, is I wanted to kind of just cover some foundational stuff, right? And you saw in the keynote, I showed the ISO 29119 Part 11, which metamorphic testing was quite a good component of that. And I think the guys from the previous session definitely kind of set you up there to kind of give you a bit more flavor into some of the real world challenges of implementing RAG architecture, GraphRAG architectures. Not to go against anything, but I made that statement earlier around prompting and shadow prompting. It is a very easy temptation to kind of go, well, you need to do better prompts, right? And what I really want from you guys to finish from lunch and maybe even break into the lunch time discussion is to kind of say, well, is prompts, my prompt tuning, my prompt threading capabilities the most important thing to get the best score or the best use out of these kind of capabilities? And I'm hoping by this introductory session, you'll start feel a little bit more comfortable that you could get away with not having to put your hands in the prompting gods for a second, as we are in Athens, but actually put them more focused on the objectives that you're trying to actually achieve with these kind of capabilities. Like I put in my opening keynote, was back in 2022 when we launched our first generative platform, and for those who were hanging around with me at the break, I don't know where they are, somewhere about, they were asking me, well, okay, so how have you evolved your thinking from maybe the platform that you released to customers in 2022 to where you are now? And I could partially argue where I am now and where I want my R&D team to be in 6 months are completely different. I kind of teased, and I know that the session that followed my session around agentic AI also reinforced that agentic AI and large action models and large vision models are really going to change the game. But in actual fact, part of it is I still think my team have got a long way to go. And I was just outside talking to one of your HR friends, and I was kind of saying, I'm on maybe 3 or 4 interviews a week for new AI engineers, right? And when I started, I got a whole stack of Oxbridge guys. Carl, who presented actually here in Athens, which you'll remember from the workshop, he did his quantum physics degree, PhD at Oxford. He then went to Cambridge and did his quantum physics PhD at Oxford. And then literally 6 months into the project, I turned around and went, well, I don't actually want quantum physicists anymore. I want astrophysicists, which narrowed it a little bit more down, and it upset Carl greatly. But the people I'm hiring at the moment as part of my team are probably less IT literate than you would expect, right? I have geologists on my team. I have all sorts of different blends of people from the business that I need to make this next generation of capability. Now, I mentioned, or I might have teased earlier about the fact that I'm originally from New Zealand, and unfortunately, contractually with the New Zealand government, I have to have some ring of power added into my slides. Otherwise, I get quite a nasty email from them. But jokes aside, typically we would kind of look at this list, this shopping list for a second, and then think to yourself, okay, I get most of this stuff, and I know by the time we walk away, hopefully maybe even at lunchtime, so we could probably have an extended lunch and grab some drinks in the sunshine, you should be familiar with all of these terms, right? And you should feel fairly confident that you know your way around and you can tell, at least have a discussion around, well, what's the applications on how I'm actually going to use this technology, and what's the right technology that I need to include. So the guys on the previous stage, they did some great examples around, RGA, relative generative answering. I'm not going to go into graph neural nets, not today, because I don't think it's that early in the morning for us to do that. But part of these different types of technique, as RAG, retrieval augmented generation, you probably maybe got a little bit of, I guess, jitters when you saw, well, okay, you're using 3 or 4 different, metrics there. What's the confidence level that the retrieval's been successful? And I had that same problem, right? And I talked to the guys over the break, and I said, yeah, we started with ML flow, and yeah, we were looking at exactly the same list, toxicity, fluidity scores. We were then saying, okay, anything below a certain score, we will, push back into the system, and then if, we'll then add this, I'm going to call it chain of thought for a second, but we'd have a certain amount of rules that we would enrich to get better answers. And, I'm going to talk a little bit about late retrieval mechanisms, which is another more modernized style for GraphRAG architectures. But as we were learning, one of my developers turned around to me and said, I just don't understand. We keep on generating output, or we call them translations, but we do a translation and, we get an output, and that's it. And I said, yeah, okay, that's kind of what this architecture is about. And they said, no, I don't think you're getting what I'm saying. It's like, why aren't we continuously using all of these nice T80 cards that we're paying a disproportionate amount of money for? Why are we just using them to process one stack of actions and then not using them anymore? Why aren't we continuously doing prompt threading which is a made-up term, by the way, but I've added it in today so you can all use it, to continuously refine and improve our results. So when we're at 80%, get to 90%, spend another 5,000 transforms if you need to get a better result until you're comfortable, because if the kit's there, minus global warming, we can continue to use it, right? So part of it was we shouldn't really expect the results that come out in a moment of time to be the results that we want. And this is what I want you to be thinking about when you're going and asking those kind of questions, like what do I need to be asking to make sure the systems that the development teams, the project teams that your product teams which you're managing are delivering something that adds value and focuses on the business side of things, because I think it's so easy to get stuck in the technology. And I kind of said that same thing, is that most of our solutions, 90% is still ML, 10% no large language model has been hurt. We have to occasionally use them, but it's not a large language model, it's typically a large vision or a large action model. Now, you'll notice for the keen eye of you as well, this is what originally Agentic was badly named, large agentic models, which quickly transformed about 2 weeks after to large action models. But that's where they actually was born. When LAM started, the idea of the agentic frameworks that the guys were talking about after I finished was about the agentic capabilities, right? So, part 1, this is the first fun time that we're going into, in essence, high-level thinking aspects through this to the lunch break, where you guys should be starting to think and ask questions about, well, how do I apply this in the real world? And then part 2, for the people who are then like, I really want to geek out, I want to do some, hard stuff. Of course, I'm not using my machine here, but part of it is I'm going to give you the blueprints on how to use and deploy large action models, open source, large vision models, open source, just code that's available today to actually use this, right? So that'll be more, I'm not going to say you can't do both, one's going to be more technical than the other. Both of them are going to be more, hopefully, thought-provoking than anything, but we'll cover both of those sessions, right? So, easy pre-lunch stuff, because obviously you've not had you had a bit of a sunshine break, but we don't want to go too heavy too hard, right? And for those one of us, like people who are just like scattering around going, well, I did bring my Alienware laptop here, I want to get some use out of it and potentially warm the entire room up by throwing some computer in, you know, feel free to be, you know, already downloading, you know, LM Studio in the background, or Alpaca, whatever you want to be able to start using it for practical implementations of this. Or if you're unfortunately just holding your phone, yeah, grab Grok if you want to have a laugh on Twitter. You know, but, you know, I'm not trying to help Elon for a second there. Or download Claude, download DeepSeek, download. I'm trying to ban the term ChatGPT, but download the apps, your favorite Gemini, whatever it is. You know, if you're really brave, you could even allocate it to a button on the side, an action button, so I can literally, like I did in Athens last time, just ask it a question like, what's quantum teleportation? What's quantum teleportation?
Quantum teleportation. An unknown quantum state is transferred from one particle to another using a phenomenon called quantum entanglement. Essentially, two particles are entangled.
Okay, thank you for that. But, you know, part of it is we're not going to be talking to him, right? And thankfully, that title, which was originally there, was actually my joke abstract. And it wasn't actually supposed to go into any acceptance. It was to try and get me off in February and March, so that way I could sit on a beach, but actually ended up on stage. So, but that aside, you know, download them. I did try downloading one while I was sat over there. The Wi-Fi is a bit slow, so maybe try your 5, 4, 3G, whatever your flavor is. So we're going to start a little bit with intro to artificial intelligence. The guys outside were talking to me a little about imposture, you know, GANs, how do you create the necessary training, safe data, and all that kind of good stuff. So we'll go into some very high-level stuff around AI, if you've not already kind of know it. We'll then go into generative AI. I want to kind of, in essence, unveil for a second the idea that actually it's not how good your prompt is. Because like I said, me versus the guys at Google, they win. You know, because as much as I used to think I was a good prompt writer, as soon as I paid $7 for Anthropic's prompt improver, which I would recommend every single person here do, don't buy a subscription to any of these, just go on to Claude, Anthropic, and pay for API credit. It's about $7, €7, whatever it is over here. And then use the prompt improver, and that's the rest of your life sorted out, right? $7, one off, you should be okay for the next 12 months, right? Jason loves it, everyone else loves it. They're just like, okay, I'm never writing a prompt again, right? So, you know, we'll unveil those kind of little tips that we can do. And then we'll go into GraphRAG. Now, again, if I was spinning my laptop up, you know, I'd be showing you, okay, how do we use Neo4j, or how do we use the vector stores? You know, what's the different, you know, approaches to doing this? But actually, there's a session tomorrow, a lab session tomorrow, which is going to cover GraphRAG, which I think, in all fairness, I'm going to lean on her to augment me a little bit on that. I'm going to tell you a lot of the principles. I'm going to tell you some of the tips and tricks on how to actually maximize it. You know, I'll go through the fact that we've got 4 or 5 knowledge graphs that we use all the time. One around context, one around the business language, one around the actual domain, one around industry specific, you know, and how you combine those and really enrich stuff to get better value out of it. So you'll remember this, or you'll remember the shirt, right? Which is, oh, it's not as bright as I thought it was going to be, which is good in a way, because you've got all my ramblings on the board. But this was me in Athens last year doing a workshop, right? And you'll realize it feels like actually we've not actually made any progress in 1 year. And actually, I can't see that for anything. I'm going to look at the slide down here. And just to let you know, all the slides that I'm presenting today, the bit.ly link, which is you can all download them for. Obviously, I got the name slightly wrong, so I apologize. But if you go to bit.ly/AI Disrupt Summit, case sensitively, then you'll be able to download all of what you're seeing today all the videos, all the examples we're doing. And you know, I'll show you the QR code if you need it, or I'll hold it up and we'll see how good your megapixels are, right? But, you know, again, you can't really see it, and I wouldn't even bother with this, but if you did see that, it's a little fish. Now, everyone's watched Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? Anyone not watched Hitchhikers or read Douglas Adams? Anyone here? Because they're the ones that can leave now. No? Kind of, maybe. So I have this tendency, especially whenever I see analysts. About 10 years ago, I was in the Valley, and I created something called the Infinite Probability Engine, which was kind of my first stab pre-large language models of being able to do this kind of technology. You know, use the model of digital twin to generate billions of permutations of possibilities, right? Using things like XPDL, Extendable Process Definition Language, and Digital Twin Definition Language, which is an OMG standard, to create quite complex models. I did this for MIT during COVID, when we were trying to do the contact tracing to create these quite elaborate Bluetooth proximity models. You know, part of it was the technology wasn't quite there yet, but I loved the idea of Babelfish, right? The idea of being able to do that universal translation component and stick it into your ear, and then it excrete the answers to the back of you, which is slightly worrying when you look at it. The other thing what you'll notice around here, and it's kind of what I was talking to everyone around over the break, is obviously these large language model routers, right? And to me, a large language model router is, well, it's bread and butter now, but it wasn't when we started. You know, we started this out where we were going, one model to rule them all. You know, we got way too excited about Minstrel being so awesome with its 8 times 120 billion mix of experts model. We thought, you know what, that's the problem solved. Then we realized that was not the problem. These weren't the droids you were looking for. Actually, you've got to run multiple models simultaneously, and you've got to be able to allow them to compete against each other. And as I teased through lunch, through the keynote, we've got 56 different varieties of models that we deploy with our deployments at the moment. And then for those who are over the lunch break, we also have language-specific ones. And we talked about the fact that, you know, the Japanese model variants are actually outperforming the US model variants, right, for Japanese. And I also kind of expressed the fact that if you speak Greek, you're better off speaking Greek or Latin to it than you are English. English is incredibly ambiguous, and everyone knows, yes, you can ask a large language model. I will ask you the question in maybe not Klingon, even though Klingon by far is the best language. It's a maths-based language, right? The closer it is to maths, the better the end result. And again, everyone then says to me, wait a second, Jonathan, are you saying to me that it's been trained on 90% of this horrible internet thing, and which is typically English, and it performs better for regional dialect? And I would say, yes, based on the fact that every other language apart from English is a decent language, right? And it's got decent structure. English is very ambiguous. And, you know, back in 1970, there was a guy who I had the pleasure to meet, a guy called Tom Gilb. I call him the grandfather of Agile based on the fact he created something called Evo in 1970, published a book, but he also published a language, and that language is called Plangwich, which now I'm saying it sounds stupid, but it's a real language. And actually, I saw someone recently benchmark Tom's language against one of the more recent ones coming out of the guys at MIT, and it was still pretty good. And we use Plangwich at the moment, which is a translation layer that we use to interpret English, because English is very unstructured and very poor, whereas we get much better results from Tom's stuff. And again, you can Google Tom Gilb. He's a legend. If you actually find him on Twitter, you'll find that he just shares his Dropbox with all his publications he's ever written. Doesn't quite understand what the internet is, so he just shares all these publications and books, which he should be charging for. But he's a living legend, as we would say. The next thing is you probably spot, and you can tell this is a year old, is, you know, I've talked about PyAuto GUI, which is seeming to go the way which we expected it to do, which is the Microsoft preference version. What else is on there? There's Kaggle. Everyone like Kaggle? Kaggle? Anyone? One person likes Kaggle. That's good. 2. Did you do the Titanic one, the example? Yeah. Everyone's done the Titanic one, right? And what did we find? The poor people actually got on the boat, not the rich people, right? And I was like, but Leo told us something completely different. Aha, but the data tells you differently if you use Kaggle's tutorial, right? And, you know, in all fairness, you know, if you're going down the route of going, well, I need to use just the standard tools, it's a good place to start your machine learning journey, right? And get familiar with Jupyter notebooks and everything else, right? But like I say, it feels like nothing's changed, even though we'll find out later it has. And it has, you know, again, I get into a lot of trouble for this slide, and people disagree with me whenever I'm at an event, but, you know, it was quite linear. You know, the investment in machine learning up to the 80s was pretty stable. It was a pretty simple trajectory with Turing leading the way, right? But as soon as we all suddenly think that 2019, this exponential growth happened with natural language generation capabilities, I still don't completely agree with that. I don't think we are exponential. I just think now it's become mainstream. You know, I can't have a haircut or get in a taxi without someone else knowing, oh, you mean ChatGPT? You know, part of it is like, it's gone to the masses, and it's become mainstream. Yes, I get it. But in actual fact, it's still a very small subset. And I want us to remember that. And I'm not playing it down, right? I'm not trying to say large language model bad, deep learning good. I'm just kind of saying not everything has to do with NLPs. And, you know, and it is just a subset. And think about that when you're trying to deploy it, right? And the problem is this keeps on backfiring on me, because as soon as I go down one route of saying it's this, it's just semantic parsing, it's just sentiment analysis, it's just bread and butter capabilities that aren't that new, they've just got better at tricking us into believing that they're actually the content they're generating is acceptable. And I said to the HR guy outside, I was like, I reviewed 100 conference abstracts for one of the main events for the year, because I sit on about 3 or 4 committees. And I could tell out of those 100, 90% of them were written by ChatGPT. And, you know, I can read, it's like being in the Matrix and seeing that person walking down the street, is I can spot them, I can spot anything generated by ChatGPT a mile away, right? And I then sat down with Marcel last week, who runs Whoopi, or whatever his Agentic AI company is. And he said, well, I'm not a natural English speaker, so I have to use it to make it sound better. And I said, that's fine. And just like the guy in the HR outside, I said to him, if you want it to sound like you, feed it a whole stack of your blogs, your previous publications, your emails, your ramblings to your family on WhatsApp, whatever, and then just say, write me this in the style of me. And I bet you 100 times, if you use that for internal email communication or abstracts or whatever it is, the style will sound so much more like you. And it's little things like that which I think as AI augmented and we start using these capabilities, there's one extreme to the other. I can spot that's being generated by an AI a mile away because he's written a PhD quality research paper in less than 1 hour on quantum teleportation. Because GPT 4.5 can write like an academic. But that's why Sam's killed it. He's never going to do another GPT because that omni capabilities, which we've got now, are so much more important. Text is less and less relevant. And this is where semantics is absolutely everything. It's all about making sure what you're passing in is valuable. And, you know, if you're passing in or reading something like a PowerPoint, which here's a PowerPoint, I know if I'm going to apply something like Tesseract or some other type of OCR stuff, it's going to extract everything that's on that screen and put it into, as you pointed out, a nice vector store. Well, it kind of loses its meaning, right? Whereas if I pass this as an image and say to me, explain this diagram with context, and then use that when I'm doing my ingestion process, this is nearly a valuable thing. And, you know, I know people say a picture's worth 1,000 words, but if you're looking at IP that your organization has, it's going to be in Visio, if anyone could buy a Visio license, right? But those ones who don't have a Visio license, it's an image. It's an image, a schematic of your blueprint of how the system currently works and how it should work with the new system. context, semantics is absolutely everything. I know everyone's thinking, this is very high level, Jonathan. Show me some rubbish, either more rubbish on GANs, right? But, you know, Tariq always talks about GANs. He got so excited about GANs. You know, he's just posted this morning a picture of him looking about 55 years younger, and he's got his tutorial that he did in California around, will AI replace us? And I said, oh, is that your son? And he didn't really appreciate that LinkedIn reference this morning. But we know, in essence, even though this technology we've got now for generative and this ability for it to be able to spot the quality of an output, you could apply GAN technology, in essence, to not only text or images, but to text, right? It's always going to refine itself to a point where it's really hard to tell if it's a fake or it's not a fake, right? And that's what it's trying to do with everything. That's what this generative capability is. That's when things like the Sumo I talked about earlier on, if you ask it to play a track, create a track that sounds like Oasis, it will do it so well to the point that even the Oasis brothers, if they weren't fighting with each other, would say, that's a track from us. It can do that. It's designed to do the style of Da Vinci or do something else because it has a great ability to, and a great capability to fool people. And even though you might say, well, Jonathan, I don't care about GANs and I don't care about seeing, for some reason, every single picture I see on an AI talk recently has got a picture of a bunny on it as a training set of data. And I said to the guys outside, I said, well, you know, we were doing something with, I think it was eBay at the time. And actually, if you ever meet the CEO, the CTO of eBay, he lives in Hawaii, right? He never goes into the office. He's always on the beach somewhere, which is where I should be today, right? And you speak to him, and he loves all this stuff, right? But when we were trying to list products onto the eBay marketplace and Amazon marketplace, we were taking, in essence, images from manufacturers of products, and we were taking SKU data, which was just very low amounts of information, and we were actually feeding it in to say, okay, this bracelet, I saw a bracelet this morning as I was nearly dying on the taxi across here. Traffic is quite interesting here, saying that you can buy these new zip ties in California for $1,000. It's just a zip tie, but a different color, right? You know, Californian people will spend their money on anything, right? But it's the same price as rent. Now, the problem is a picture of a bracelet with no context, it could be an ankle bracelet, it could be a necklace, it could be different things to different people. And this is where, historically, they've shipped this out. And I said to the guys at the lunch, I said, well, you know, in the old days, we used to use Amazon Mechanical Turk, right? And I remember going to Johannesburg, and literally the press, when I turned up to the event, was saying, we've got the highest unemployment rate in the entire planet, and you're coming and telling us about AI and how it's going to replace us. We don't really want you here, which is not the first time anyone said that, right? But at the same time, I said, no, wait a second. This is going to mean that your unemployed, skilled, domain-skilled experts who know trainers, know sneakers, know jeans, know whatever, they can get paid $40 an hour by Amazon Turk just to look at pictures of cats and say, misclarified, this is not a cat, it's a tiger or something. You know, they'll get paid for that. No, it's data entry. It's not great, but, you know, actually, we need to have huge amounts of sets of data. And I said to the team who I was talking to outside, I said, what we started doing with eBay and Amazon is actually, we didn't get training data set based on Bing image search. We actually went and harvested websites with Levi's, with jeans on them, and metadata, all nicely tagged for us, and we scraped all that information and used that as actual sample sets, millions and thousands of images. That was our data. And you would not believe, based on the fact that I'm not allowed to say it, but the amount of scraped information I now use as a source of information when I'm looking at something. You know, if I'm looking at Spotify to play Taylor Swift, of course I take all of the Docusaurus repos. Of course, I take all of the training stuff. Maybe, if I'm feeling really, really risky, I'll get the Reddit stuff and pull that down. I pull all that information in because it is a source of knowledge. It's a blueprint of how to use Spotify. It's how users use Spotify. So, I think part of it is, even though this doesn't sound that exciting, the use cases are. And everyone's seen this. It's maybe the most boring thing in the world. This person doesn't exist.com. It is one of my guilty pleasures, right? It's one of those things of just refreshing the image and then watching the old NVIDIA engine generate images of people that look like people. And for all of us here, we've all used Stable Diffusion, right? Anyone not use Stable Diffusion? Anyone going to use Stable Diffusion when they get home? Hopefully. There we go. That's one person. So I would recommend go to the Git repository of Focus with too many C's in it. So it's F-O-C-C-U-S. And they bring down a Stable Diffusion variant that is incredibly good at generating images. Like, really good. And this guy at the front will say, yeah, last time you put a picture of your boss in it, which is another HR violation, and then literally said, turn him into Poseidon, because we were going to go to Poseidon's temple, right? And then a half-naked guy started generating on my screen. And I was like, hold on a second. This is when I have to stop Stable Diffusion doing what it's designed to do, create a reproduction, right? And so, yes, this technology is good, and it's also not good, right? And my other slides, which thankfully you won't be glad not to see this afternoon, is I asked it this morning. I literally just pulled ChatGPT out and went, where's the flush on the toilet? And I was looking for like 5 minutes. And then literally, thankfully, I don't use ChatGPT, but it was a joke. It literally turned around and said, oh, there might be a flush up in the ceiling on the left-hand side. It might look like this. I was like, oh, thanks for that. I was like, never come anywhere. I've been to Japan. I've used really quite complex toilet systems. This was kind of quite straightforward. Anyway, nobody wants questions on this. This was just a kind of a quick intro thing. So that was really, really basic stuff, right? And I wanted you all to be kind of thinking about, well, what's the different questions that I need to think differently about? And we will break for some questions after this intro and into a little bit more detail, a bit more, I'd say, a little bit more kind of hands-on. And I like the idea with the Microsoft thing, right? Because I met the CEO at Microsoft quite recently at a quantum event, right? So I joke about quantum teleportation being a joke abstract, but it was based on the fact that when I was in the Santa Clara offices, Microsoft HQ, they were doing a B-roll for the new quantum stuff they're building, right? So we acquired $3 billion quantum companies last year, all to do quantum manufacturing of components for quantum computers, not testing qubits, right? Which sounds like a much more exciting thing. And of course, if you go to Microsoft HQ, I sat with the CEO, and we're like, oh, are you using Microsoft Q#? No. Well, actually, my guys are using Q#, but Q# is the quantum language by Microsoft, right? And I asked him this question, which was, well, why is your only quantum machine you've got in your marketing division next to a blue screen ready to record stuff? Because it's more PR than it is quantum research, right? And yes, there's use cases. We do a great one with Amazon, with Microsoft at the moment around MRI scans, right? Very few use cases where you can apply this technology where they take huge amounts of MRI data, and if you've been to an MRI scanner recently, I'm not trying to make a recurring event, but next door is a data center. There's a huge amount of data that they take from the scans. And I used to work at Hitachi, and we did make those MRI scanners, but it expects everything to be perfect. It expects you not to breathe, takes the scans, and it runs the algorithms against it. Now, obviously, in quantum, you can run billions of traditional algorithms that are designed for traditional computers, but will run much faster, which means they can get higher fidelity, i.e. improved resolution, by using quantum machines. Now, there's only about 6 quantum machines on the planet. I think 2 are in Europe. The actual workload to do anything on quantum is about 30,000 an hour. So it's not like it's a standard compute thing where you go, to the cloud or to the quantum computer. It's not really like that, right? But I like the Microsoft example, which I definitely went off on a tangent there for and tried to fill an extra 10 minutes. So, like I said, don't use ChatGPT. And then for some other reason, I then added ChatGPT to my slides. Now, what you'll notice here as an alternative to ChatGPT is Jonathon.ai, which is me. So obviously, if you go, what I've noticed by doing these things more than once is if you go somewhere like here, which is a learning establishment, they don't like having ChatGPT available on the network because obviously all the students start cheating, right? So part of it is it's blocked by the Wi-Fi. Now, obviously, instead, you can talk to Jonathon.ai. Now, Jonathon.ai is 3.7 Sonnet. I say it's in a private landscape. It kind of is. But what you will notice about Jonathon.ai, which makes it a bit more interesting, is its personality is very similar to me, which is actually a negative. And then the second thing, it's also got a RAG architecture behind it. So when you ask it about things like NOP Commerce, which is just a dummy website, it will give you code for NOP Commerce, right? Part of it is it's trained on certain information. Equally, if you ask it what is metamorphic testing, it will tell you that it'll tell you the description, but it'll also show you the ISO 29119 Part 11 source where it came from, because I've fed into the RAG architecture those documents. So, part of it is if you ask it what's emotional testing, it makes it up. It literally says emotional testing is hiring testers who are emotional, which, in all fairness, sounds like a great idea. And I did advocate, literally about 15 years ago, drunk crowd testing, which I hired a whole stack of students in Munich to use the Domino's website intoxicated, because the problem was the fall-off of people ordering pizza on a Friday night at 10 o'clock was huge. So we learned a lot from it paying people who were drunk. I'm not doing that mistake again, but talk to me later about that. So anyway, part of it is it makes it up, and it's quite believable. But if you ask Jonathon.ai, it will actually say to you, it's again a technique out of the ISO standards, and it's about incrementally change in states off the machine, not emotional states. So part of it is ChatGPT will make stuff up. ChatGPT 4.0, which is the learning, reckoning, chain of thought version, is a very powerful Google search, right? Part of it is I asked it yesterday, which is my normal task when I'm doing these things. You say, what time is Jonathon on stage? Now, obviously, depending on if you were looking at the agenda this week, I started off about 3 o'clock with no lunch break, the graveyard shift, and then I ended up with a lunch break between. Now, you'd all sit there and go, well, I know, it tells you if you speak to whichever it was last, scrape the internet on whatever day. Now, if you ask ChatGPT 4.0, what time is Jonathon on stage today, tells you exactly when I'm on stage, and then it also shows a social media post from yesterday where I posted saying I'm on stage at 2 o'clock, and I'm sat there going, Google. I've always wanted to use that functionality, but it's not a real thing. Anyway, so part of it is, yes, use it, but obviously you need to activate it, right? We saw this hype circle, so nobody cares. So, obviously everyone knows Eliza. You know about Eliza. Most people know about Eliza. So the first LLM implementation was back in 1965, which was actually done, I don't know if it's MIT, and it was actually a thought experiment for a psychologist, right? They wanted to understand what would be the relationship of, I keep on watching those Gemini adverts where people are just laid in bed going, I can ask you anything. You're sat there going, I don't think you should ask it anything. And then secondly, I did an interview with Steve Wozniak about 2 years ago. And I love Steve. Steve is a really nice guy. Tim hates me with a vengeance, because every time I see Tim in his sandals, he always shouts at me about why I don't deliver what he wants, which usually is unreasonable. But Wozniak is a genuinely nice person, right? And I said to Woz, I thought, nothing's scripted. He won't do anything scripted. And so I asked him, what do you think about the internet? Which, never ask anybody about what the internet was, right? Not any over the age of 50 anyway. It's like, nope. But anyway, he literally said, it isn't what it was supposed to be. What it was supposed to be was knowledge sharing. It was bringing communities and universities together to enrich mankind and make it a better place. Now, I can't definitely describe the internet as that, especially with Elon's stock price at the moment. Part of it is there's a lot of negativity. It's probably not the best place to train a large language model, right? Might be the easiest way. And of course, if you speak to Sam, Sam will tell you the same thing. Sam will say, yes, 90% of what I use the trained our systems on is illegally content that should not be there. And it's his copy of, the whole J.K. Rowling season that he had in, on his FTP that allows it to be that good, because it's looking at stuff. I love it for analyst reports, because I go and want to pay for an ISO standard, and then I go, why am I paying for an ISO standard? This can find it, because it's just trolled the entire internet. But Wozniak said, the internet is not the place what it was supposed to be. And then I, as my normal demo would be, he said, when he started with Jobs, this was a great solution, right? I could say to it, and I'm going to do it now because it won't work, but I could say to it, hey Siri, what time is it? And 10 years ago, it would tell me the time, because it didn't go to a linguistics, semantic, cloud instance to translate my language. It was hard-coded to listen for people who were only English, speaking, what time is it, to then give you the time. Whereas now, no internet connectivity on stage doesn't work. So he said that actually the technology's regressed, because we've added things like Lewis, the Microsoft linguistic platforms, and we've added all this complexity, and it just doesn't work. So as an emotional kind of being for a second, obviously the story is the secretary loved that was her name, and she was just completely obsessed with this large language model, that it was real, which is slightly worrying for many reasons, right? The second thing, which I don't know why I put this diagram on here, apart from to help people pick their favorite large language model, right? And there is no real answer. But, part of it is obviously I started very much like most people did with Claude. And, I said to the guys at the lunch break, it's like, my favorite variant at the moment, which I usually deploy when I'm showing these workshops on my laptop, is I load up LM Studio or Alpaca or whatever it is, and then I pull down Nemo. And it's not because I like the movies. I used to like Nemo for about 2 years since it came out. Nemo is an 8 billion model that performs like a 12 billion. Now, you might say, wow, Jonathan, you've just not changed anything that I've ever learned in my entire life. But I've gone through so many iterations of Llama and DeepSeek, and benchmarking them, and then just realizing that they're iterations of nothingness. That actually, for foundational models, as much as I don't want to say it, Claude did a really good job, right? And they've done a lot of good things in this space. So has Anthropic, so has your mixtural of experts models. They were quite foundational, very, common practice. And the reason, again, why I use Nemo for Minstrel is because it fits into the NPUs of any of the Copilot enabled laptops, which I would normally have on the stage. That NPU, which will do 30 trillion operations per second, but it's 30 trillion in the sense of compute capability of large language models or any kind of compute, they will be able to process that model really nicely. So if I have to have one model in there, that's my model of choice. Of course, everyone has their favorites, right? But I also said, and I think the guys on the previous session said it as well, is your large language model router should select the best model for the best activity at runtime, right? And equally, it should play them off against each other. It should work out which one's better at generating the outcomes through those different measurements, And not just run one thread, run multiple threads against each other to compete. So you have to use more than one model at one stage. So one stage of the transition could be I'm talking to the system in English, and I want Python. Of course, I'm not going to use my Claude, well, I might use my Claude 3.7 code, what dropped last week, but that's obviously an online model at the moment. I think you will be able to get it if you go into Bedrock, which is the AWS landscape. You can pull that down. But in the old days, I might have used another code generation large language model, right? I might Codex T5 or some other kind of thing, was fine, right, at creating code. But I'm running one against the other at the same time. There's at least two models, preferably more, but two models in memory at the same time, playing against each other. Now, I usually would say, hail to the king, but there's not as many Duke Nukem fans as there used to be. But, I took the mickey out of a younger Tariq on that thread this morning. But I thought last year, when we were all finished doing prompt engineering workshops for an entire year, that, we need to do prompt engineering, it's a skill you're going to need. And then myself, Tariq, Dione, and I forget the other guy's name, we all sat on a panel and we all went, yes, prompting is not the future. And then afterwards, we kind of went back on that and said, well, those skills are still useful. The ability to read code is useful. The ability to read English is useful, but it's not the answer, right? But I would say, and this guy will know because he went to the workshop last year, is the Markdown format is still the winner, right? As much as Anthropic prompt generator does a very good job at hiding the Markdown, it's still Markdown. And there's a lot better, more consistent responses by using this method than the methods that I was doing. Again, I was a very naive, young guy who was like, okay, I'm going to do beautiful prompt chains, beautiful prompt tuning. We're going to really focus on this. And then when, nah, I think we're just going down this route and we'll pay $7 and we'll be fine. But why, right, is the question. And so Jason, I looked at Jason's code recently, and he put it onto open source. I think it's probably on one of the next slides. He put all his code on open sourced. And so first thing I do is go and look at his prompts, right? Because, it's kind of that, feels like it's a special source, but then you kind of go into KFC and you just realize it's just like salt. There's not really anything there. It's just those 150 spices that are in a packet, right? They're not that special, right? And so he had this amazing thing which he did, which was he used to give people backstories, like the craziest backstories in the entire world, right? It would be this accessibility, obviously the new European Accessibility Act that's coming in this year, later this year. It's like, is a huge opportunity. If anyone do accessibility? Anybody want to get loads of money by the end of the year? There you go. That's the easiest way. Just start doing audits, right? Because WCAG was useless, right? It was just foundational. Whereas now, there's things like haptics involved in accessibility and really complex scenarios. And so I went through one of his prompts, and it was like, this person has 3 dogs, drives his children to work and misses every keynote, and then, this elaborate story. And I was like, that doesn't really work, right? You don't start with, as a MIT AI engineer with exactly 42 years of experience, because obviously 42 is the meaning of everything, and, likes to play cricket at the weekend. You don't need to go to that granular level of description for your persona of your prompt. But then he'd show me things where he'd go, well, look at this accessibility tester. They've just said that as they've just had a newborn and they're holding the app, because they're left-handed, with their less dominant hand, and they try and reach this icon, they can't reach to it. And I'm like, okay, but did we really need to go to that level of detail? And I think the answer was, yes, the devil is in the detail, and you can go all the way down that way to create quite complex and robust prompts that are incredibly diverse and incredibly fruitful. But then you can also just say, as the previous speakers said, you know, what's the CEO of Microsoft? And I'd hope, because I have met Bill and he's actually a nice guy, you say Bill Gates still, right? Because 90% of the internet is still sat there, right? But, you know, if you give it information, most of the time, it's going to come up with this, which is, I have no idea when Jonathon was on stage talking about quantum teleportation, because we know it's 3.7 Claude, right? We know it's a variant. I know what version of the release it is. It doesn't have access to the internet. And I love that about offline large language models. It's like, thankfully, it's not just ChatGPT and Google, right? So it doesn't have that contextual information. And that's what I want, because what I want it to do, if I was ever going to use a large language model, is I want to use it for that transform. And I also want to be able to give it a set of information which I want it to process. And then I want to say, forget everything you've ever thought about anything and just answer it based on the information I've provided you. Because anything else is just the internet, in Wozniak's word, an evil place. I don't want that information, right? I just want the information that I'm providing you, which I've gone to great lengths of hiring 5 Apple engineers to do my ingestion process for literally the last 4 years of unstructured data to structured data, and then building all this quite complex architecture around. I don't want you to just use, you know, Google to find the answer, right? And so there's a temptation, and you know, again, I try to resist this. It's a real hard resistance of, you know, resistance is futile situation. You know, you can give it the HTML of the session that we're in today, right? Which, as of whenever I did that, which is 8 o'clock yesterday when I was flying over here, was still the old abstract, right? And so, yeah, of course, I'm going to pass it the HTML and say, read this as a source of knowledge, right? And, of course, it can read domain object models and page object models, and it can extract text. It's very good at doing that, right? It's very good at interpreting that information and then putting it into a format that you want it to do based on, here's some HTML, here's some context, here's what I'm seeing. Now, of course, if I then said, well, Jonathon, you keep on saying to us large vision models and YOLO and, you know, all the other capabilities are the way forwards. Well, you can see the problem with just vision. You know, 20 years we've been doing vision. You know, OpenCV has had better days at looking at screens because we know the context is in that structure, which is very easy to understand. Equally, I don't want this, right? I don't want a picture of me walking down wherever I am, talking, which I posted yesterday, being part of my Omni response, right? Because I know that, yes, it knows to be able to use the internet, and this is where Omni, I think, is quite a scary capability within ChatGPT, because it will take the information. Now, again, what Sam said he wasn't going to do, and obviously he did, he bent the knee like everyone should do if they're Game of Thrones fans, but he's got the links for everything, right? He's got the links that this came off my YouTube channel. He's got the links saying that this came from Product-Led Hub website. It's starting to give that, I'm going to say, trustworthiness of the response, because I'm asking it, when am I on stage? It's now telling me, yeah, he's on stage at 10:15 to 10:45 EET. I don't know what EET is. It must be a new abbreviation to me. But, you know, part of it is it will just take the information. So I now know what version of my slides are. So how do we do this realistically, right? How do we get to that point where, you know, we're in a more controlled location, we've taken all this stuff offline, we're starting to deploy and build this basic framework. You know, the conversation I just had with the HR guy was like, whenever I speak to HR, they say, oh yeah, well, when you speak to a new candidate, just feed their CV into ChatGPT and then ask ChatGPT, what question should I ask them? I go, you know, something called PII data, you know, personal identifiable data. There's also this thing called GDPR, and, you know, maybe, you know, I shouldn't be passing in that you're only 14 or whatever your age is, and it should then give me responses which are age sensitive, right? Part of it is I shouldn't be passing that information. I should be removing PII data. I should be taking, normalizing, or I guess the obfuscating is probably the correct word, obfuscating the personal data before I pass it into a machine. Now, of course, I had to do this last week for Gartner, and I was like a bit of a hurry, and I had all my sensitive information. I was like, well, I'm not putting that anywhere. I'm just going to spin it up locally, put it into a container, run it, and then destroy it, right? I don't want that vector database going anywhere that it shouldn't be going, right? Apart from my recycle bin. So part of it is you can download it, and you can see here, if you're very keen-eyed, you can see the MPU not doing a very good job on my laptop on the flight over, completely offline, which is why there's no signal there. I'm just sat on a plane, and I'm just doing those prompts, right? I'm building the vector store. I'm doing all the stuff I want. I'm downloading Minstrel. I'm ready to go kind of thing. And that's what, that's one way of approaching this problem, right? Is to take it offline. We put everything in Iron Bank. We really control the environment that we're actually in. And then, but there is problems with this, right? And obviously this is pre-graph, which is our next session, which I think I've actually gone slightly over with this thing. What time is it? It's 2 o'clock. Well, I don't know. We'll keep on going until someone waves at me and says, we're hungry or something. But yeah, I've done this stupid mistake, right? I've asked whoever this Jonathon guy is, and, again, offline, no internet, 11 o'clock yesterday, and it's like, oh, Jonathon, he's the guy who created SpecFlow. And I'm thinking, I own the domain of SpecFlow, but unfortunately, the Tricentis end of life it a couple of months ago, and now everyone's really upset. And also, I'm banned from the Ministry of Testing, but that's a different story completely. But part of it is this information is inaccurate, right? And this is why you can't trust just asking it a question and expecting an output without giving it context, without feeding it information. And the example that I did do, which isn't in this deck, I don't think, which it might be interesting to see what happens on the next slide. But part of it is if I give it context and I pass it in, here's Jonathon, here's the events that he does, here's the output I expect you to provide in JSON format, not because I'm asking about JSON. But ironically, again, I sent Jason this same message. I said, I just got off the plane, and it says that you created a book on Agile, which he is not an Agile person, neither am I. Apologies for that. It's only because I weren't invited to go skiing 20 years ago. But he also wasn't the founder of AppVans. And I sent him this, and he went, yeah, what do you want me to do, right? And then I also got on the plane yesterday as I'm on my final hop, and then, like every good citizen, just like I said to you, download the apps. Those apps, not the dating apps, the prompt apps. And I'm going to see if there's audio here. But I then went to my favorite mobile app and said to Grok, which is a Grok of, I'm not using the bad language here. I'm hoping it's going to play. No, it's not going to play. But what happened is Grok, and you can see I'm still on a plane because the plane's here, right? Is Grok went off and it said, well, I could do this. I can find out about Jonathon, no problems. And so it went off, looked at all these different references, and then provided me the references. And I did the exact same thing. I've got some signal on the 5G on this one. As soon as I landed, asked Gemini. First time I've ever used Gemini on the mobile app. I said, who's Jonathon Wright? And it gave me quite an interesting description of what I've contributed to the AI space, what I've published in the last year. Very comprehensive. And I have no direct problem with Gemini, apart from the lack of sharing of the models. They have models available, but they're no way as comprehensive as what Google actually has running in Gemini, which is a very good platform. But again, you can't really rely on those platforms to do all your work, because it's inside of a very unfederated public cloud, even Anthropic and AWS. So like I said, $10 is all I'm asking you to spend today, is go on to Anthropic. I should get some commission for this, might be $1. Go to the prompt improver into the console, write your worst prompt you've ever written. And then it will give you a prompt which is beautifully formatted. Now, don't get me wrong, let's spend some of that $10 you've got. If you then click thinking mode, once you go into it, it will then run multiple iterations of creating a better prompt after it's already created a better prompt. Now, Jason used to always say, what's the first prompt in my prompt chain after asking it a question? Obviously, it's, what question should I ask? And then it tells you that you get the system to create a better prompt. And then you compare the prompt that the system has decided to generate versus the original, and then you go through and run the RAGs or whatever it is afterwards, right? But this now has thinking, 3.7 exists, on Claude on there. It has the reckoning on, which is the Omni capability, plus the chain of thought, and it'll be the best $10 you've ever spent. So there's my only pitch, which for a company that will be acquired at some point in time in the near future, not that I'm also telling you to go to the stock exchange and start spending some of your hard-earned cash. But if I take, this is why I don't write prompts as well, by the way, create a list of conferences that Jonathon spoke at. Okay, that's fine. So it will then create this on the left-hand side. It looks, it smells, it feels very much like Markdown. It's not good. You know, that's why I said you have to use the prompt improving capability, which is a little tick box. But it starts off with that same format. Mission at the top. This is what I want you to do. Then you've got the embedded set of data. Obviously, I'm going to call it a vector store because in theory, if you move it to something else, you want to provide it a file, not, you know, everything in JSON. And then you've got a number of steps that you're expecting it to follow, right? You're expecting it to go through and be concise, list at least 20 events, put it in a particular format. You might give it an example of the format that you want. These are all very good prompting capabilities, right? And yes, you're going to get a response which is slightly embarrassing, right? Which is 10, as I've requested. Everything seems to be 10 whenever you ask a GPT. I don't like the number 10, but it'll give you 10 recommended things. Now that is still rubbish, right? That's my viewpoint. I know we'll finish this, then we'll go grab some lunch, and then we'll get a little bit more heavy in the afternoon. But I want to spend my money. I want to spend that $10, right? Because what else am I going to do? Buy coffee? You know, hit the thinking button, take this, hit the improve prompt button in the top right-hand corner, and then set it on fire, right? Go and tell it, go off, let's parameterize it a little bit more, let's get it, you know, passing in a list of speakers, not just me, so it's me and this gentleman on the first row. It's, you know, go and look at academic databases, go and look at professional sites like LinkedIn and go and harvest that stuff. Just go to town, spend my money. Here it is, right? And yes, it's going to sit there with the reckoning capability, and it's going to say, okay, I'm thinking. Now, what I'd say about reckoning, or reasoning, depending on how you want to define it, is it gives you a blueprint of how it wants to think. I then use this to split off my prompt threads and my prompt chains to go, okay, well, I can create a better, more focused prompt that's going to look at academic papers that have been published in the last 4 months that are specific to this. I want to narrow that search down. So actually, its thinking gives me ideas of how I can then write better prompt chains to get better quality results out of it. And of course, I then get this, which is this last slide before we go for lunch, so don't worry. I then get, yeah, you were in Vegas talking at the DevOps Enterprise Summit in 2023, and now I've got a list which I didn't put in this version, but is a list which is every single event of the 100 events that I did last year, date, time, what my talk was called, everything else. This is actually quite valuable, whereas I started off with a list of 10 events that it decided it could find, whereas now, actually I've got something that's quite reusable. Now, for those who are in the room going, I'm still not that excited, Jonathon, this button here, get code, is also the best thing about it, because it then gives you the Python code to make it into something you can run offline, you can run with your own models. It gives you all the wrappers and everything else. Wrappers, we're not talking about PDD here, but you can load this in Visual Studio Code and then actually turn that into a repeatable unit, right? So you hit that code button and off you go. You've got something that is going to be very focused at doing a number of prompts and a number of prompt chains, bringing everything offline, using different vector stores and RAG architectures, which we're going to talk about next, but actually is giving you good results in a format that you can specify. You can stick an API on it. If you've got LM Studio or the other one we talked about, the Alpaca thing, you can literally give it a port and say, OK, create me an API, and you can get all this really quickly. So what I'm hoping you got out of this hour and slightly extended version is how do we get past this idea of barrier of entry to prompting, but also how do we make sure we're starting to take advantage, we're asking the right questions, we're defining things clearer, and we're thinking about how the technology can make us better at what we do. So anyway, with that said, that guy's going to say to me, it's lunchtime, so everyone's really hungry. I'm not going to go into any, well, you can ask him questions if we've got time, but otherwise you can just grab me over lunch and ask me something really difficult like, what's my favorite large language model?
So yeah, indeed before break, we can have a few questions if you want, and then it's an hour break for lunch. Are there any questions for the first part? Yep. Can we get the mic?
Which one you are referring in the first row?
What?
In which section you are referring when you're saying in the first row?
Can you repeat the question?
I don't know. I think it might be you. It's your talk tomorrow on product-led automation, AI. It's the certification. He's handing out certificates at his event tomorrow, by the way, and food tokens. So, make sure, what time is it? 2 o'clock tomorrow?
Yeah, it's
2 o'clock? It's the one. It's the same slot as this, right?
Yeah.
Just a better version of it, right?
Yeah, it's a funny stuff, but I'm coming from the QA world, so I wanted to know how all this fits when it comes to quality. You talked about a lot of things, about the models, about the technologies, the prompt engineering. Everybody is a buzzword right now, so
Yep.
how do you see that fits in that?
Yeah, so I'm not standing between too many people and lunch, but partly why I said Jonathon.ai is because it does have it has in essence, I'm going to say Neo for a second because you can only do maximum of 2 matrix examples. But if you remember the famous moment where Neo wakes up and he says, I know Kung Fu, right? Jonathon.ai knows QA, right? So you can ask metamorphic testing, you can ask him about boundary value analysis, you can talk about equivalence partitioning, you can talk about different types of coverage techniques with Jonathon. Tonight, when you get back home and in bed, you can just have those exchanges and it will help you test better, right? Now, we all know the real story, which is Neo wakes up and he goes and fights Morpheus, right? Morpheus knows the same level of Kung Fu, has the same large language model, but he gets his ass kicked. And the reason is Neo is a newbie with a large language model. Morpheus knows how to bend these systems to make them work. He's applying wisdom, knowledge, on top of what they're interpreting to actually beat Neo. So part of it is just alone, a large language model isn't going to succeed. You have to bring your patterns to it, and it's your wisdom, which is going to be incredibly valuable until we're all replaced in 20 years or 30 years. That's going to make the difference. So in a Yoda kind of way, and I'm not going to try and do a Yoda accent, the wisdom is where we add value. Because knowledge graphs only know knowledge. They don't know wisdom, and they don't know about your life experiences. So they're incredibly valuable. Apply that to what you're doing. Right. I'll let everyone take lunch.
Yep, let's go for lunch.
And cold beers. No.
Yep. See you in an hour. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Everyone's still alive after lunch, which is good news. And I'm realizing now that I need a clicker as well, otherwise I'll never get past this giant picture of my face. So, we said it'd get a little bit more technical this afternoon. I know there are a few people at the front were just asking me about the slides, and my camel case bit.ly link is AI Disrupt Summit, all one word. in the right sensitive language, but I'll share it afterwards. So if you want to come and ask me for the slides, obviously these aren't my full-fledged, full-fat taste, all the links and stuff. But of course, if you want to know like the repositories and everything else, that version will include it. So yeah, just grab me afterwards. Okay, so it's interesting, you know, apologies for this person's head that was in the way when I took this photo, right? So the previous one, I actually owned the rights for with Gartner, but this was actually at Gartner a couple of weeks back, which is the new Gen AI wave. Now, obviously, unless you've got the best eyesight in the entire world, you're not going to be able to read what it says there, so I've obviously written it on the right-hand side in the order it comes in across this landscape. But in essence, we, you know, in the first session, we kind of said, okay, let's cover off these talking points. This session, we want to cover off some of this talking points about, well, what is it actually? How are we deploying this stuff? And then how are we actually going to get the value in using this technology, right? And so, you know, I said there's a few things which I thought were interesting last year. You know, I didn't want to go down this domain-specific model route. However, they are the big trends. The big cool trend at the moment is very small, very specific, very fine-tuned, industry-specific models such as aerospace, healthcare, tiny models that can do great things. You know, we were just out grabbing a coffee, and this car broke down on the road, and then all this, I don't know if it was going to set on fire, but all the fire team started turning up, and straight away they're trying to push the car off the road, maybe try and put out the flames. And I kind of said, well, you know, if I wanted to, I could stick a small DSL model on my phone as my personal mechanic, and then I could pull out my phone, use the LiDAR functionality which I've got on my phone to overlay a blueprint off the engine management system. I could plug in my ODB port for the engine management stuff. I could access the CAN network on the actual car, and I could also remotely dial in a mechanic to fix the problem in real time. Now, of course, that's a use case, right? That's a very simple, I say a simple use case, but that's something we could do today, right? We could literally no longer pay for mechanics to troubleshoot our problems. I'd rather just take it to the garage and then, you know, it comes back cleaner than it was when I put it in the garage. But, you know, again, it's a use case that you could potentially use. Now, what else is interesting on this list? We kind of hover into this GraphRAG landscape, right? And I kind of teased the fact that, you know, quite early on, I was maybe a little bit too excited about knowledge graphs. I maybe spent probably the last 3 or 4 years just singing their praises, right? And I kind of alluded to it earlier when, you know, I started with this team. I've got about 70 engineers, R&D engineers, working on our internal AI platforms, our Agentic platforms. And the first roadblock I got back in 2021 was this ingestion problem. And so, you know I saw someone with slides saying hallucinations or something, right? And I would partially, obviously a lot of people might argue with this, but I would say, you know, those early days where things were hallucinating, I'm going to partially blame the people using the tools because I'm not sure what they were expecting from these kind of outputs. But we kind of learned that same problem really quickly, right? So back in 2021, I hired, our first customer was NATO. NATO being something you should all know of, so it's okay. So we provided these NATO declassified specifications, because obviously you don't really want military secrets on your laptop, which I have in the past because I've worked at GCHQ, the Pentagon, and some other secure companies, but you don't really want those classified information stuck into a large language model. I think literally the last person who came up to me says, you know, should I use ChatGPT? I said no, is the quick answer to that. So we passed in these declassified documents, these NATO specs, And yes, this was 2021, we had hallucinations, right? I would say to it, give me a list of all of the requirements within this document. And of course, it comes back, it'd say, oh yeah, there's 7,422, and then because it's a large language model, remember, instruct, the word that says follows the model, that's been added to talk to the human. So ChatGPT is an instruct model. It's designed to have a conversation, i.e., last year's rant was, you should never one-shot or one-prompt something, because the whole point of the chat is you have a conversation, right? You have a conversation with it. Now, that instruct capability that sits on the end of a model is fooling the end user to be able to have that human communication method, right? I don't want that. I don't want instruct. I'd rather not have instruct, because instruct's the one that allows me to go back and say, actually, there's 8,422 in there, and it'll agree with me. And I don't want that. That's the worst thing I could possibly want in the entire world. So what did we do? I alluded to it earlier. I hired 5 Apple engineers, and I just sat them down, and I said, I want to take unstructured formats, and I want to turn them into structured formats. And of course, straight away, they're all excited about data lake house architectures and using knowledge graphs and building all this fantastic stuff. And I go, fine, you go off and do it, and then come back and tell me how we've improved. Now, if I was being completely honest, that first product, probably 60% of the development time was on the ingest process alone. It was just getting data into better formats that we could understand. And what we really did, which is, again, underwhelming laser, was we just created one graph. And that one graph, which we realized was a mistake. I loved Neo4j when it came out, and I kind of was all in for Neo4j, and we created a graph off document structure. So the DoD had a term for one of their control systems. The document would be ingested. We'd start building in the structure of the systems and the dependencies, the ecosystems of ecosystems, all the complexity into about that document. And that's great. I use that as, I call that, which is incorrectly named, I call that, knowledge, domain knowledge from the customer. However, that was not that useful. That was just one thing, which is really a map, a galaxy map of just what the document and the structure of the document. And I was talking to the guys outside and saying, well, if we have a term within the DoD, let's call it NPL, it will say, oh, well, I know a system's called NPL, which is the Network Protocol Language, whatever it is. And the problem is, inside of the DoD, that makes a lot of sense. But then I add the next layer over to it, which is this one on the right, and I'm applying military terms, terms of reference, terms of service, terms of engagement. And of course, there's conflicting relationships between these two. And that's where it suddenly gets quite challenging. Someone was just like they were really celebrating something there. They just finally compiled some code for the first time. But part of it was that relationship between two, in essence, separate knowledge graphs was our first step towards realizing that actually we needed more. We run about 4 graphs at the moment, but in actual fact, one of those graphs is industry specific. So obviously went out for coffee, and then he said, oh, well, I care about quality, right? And I gave the example of Jonathon.ai knowing equivalence partitioning and boundary value analysis. That's all well and good. But really, if I'm asking something to do equivalence partitioning, I want it to, in essence, try and solve the problem. I don't want a description of what equivalence partitioning is or metamorphic testing. I want it to say, here's the blueprint of how I do metamorphic testing. So at this particular case, this system here needs to know how to apply the art of testing or quality or whatever you want to call it against another system. So part of it is what I'm trying to say is knowledge graphs seem like a great idea, but they will get out of control quite quickly. And then I think the example which came from the RAG guys that had me on earlier was like this very simple kind of example, right? Which is, I have a vector database, and maybe I store certain information into my vector database, right? Let's say I have, which is why I called it prompt threading. Let's say I ask a particular translation, right? I do a transition which says, feed in a document from the vector store, map it to using the GraphRAG, get the RAG to then say to it, I'm going to pull this information in for this particular transition. Now, we can all see the problem with that. The problem is, as soon as you change the source of knowledge, i.e. the vector database, then in theory, that semantic search was wrong because it's out of date. However, this is where we spent the next 30% of our time, was actually the mapping of the change of contextual information in, not call it real time, but in nearly real time, as things change, as I have a conversation with you on the front row and I say, no, this system must be able to deliver it within 5 meters of accuracy when it's doing a deployment. That new content means that the old content and the old answers are completely out of date. So we then had to create, in essence, an impact analysis of all the referential integrity of all the system to know what we need to update and where in the system, where in the knowledge graphs, it needs to update the sources of information. So this is quite hard because actually it's, I'm going to say it's a versioning control problem because that's how our guys turned up originally. They went, oh, this is really easy. We'll create a UID and we'll just put it into some versioning thing and we'll be able to understand, you know, where things have changed and then, you know, fix it and heal it and stuff. And I said, no, it's not that simple, right? It's a harder problem to deal with. And that's the problem with knowledge graphs, is they're continuously changing. So are these vector stores, is the information that you have on it can get out of date very quickly. And it doesn't matter what chunking strategy you're using or how you're getting the information into that, what information you're reading, what information you're ingesting and translating, that can be inaccurate very quick. And I think this is where, you know, having documentation libraries, and we talked about it earlier, this conflict of information, of conversations that have happened between people, between colleagues around the water cooler, not that anyone has a new water cooler or even turns up to an office anymore, but all these conversations change it, and it is continuously updating, and so does your document store, so does all the information that you're doing, so does the answers, so does the generated content from these systems. It has to continuously evolve. And I've not got the demo in here, but typically when we get information coming from a new source, so if someone published a new Confluence page with some new conflicting information, it goes back and it gives chains to people going, oh, you're the owner of this, you've changed this, now these things are out of date, you said it was 5 meters, over here it says 7.5 meters, but only in Japan, what's the right information? And this is where at the end of the last session, I was trying to say to you, actually, the most important person in this entire structure is you, or maybe potentially this person here, who's a conference that we did in Sweden, which I think I've got next month. But part of what you see here, which is a very simple thing, there's anomaly detection and all sorts of other stuff. You know, this is a very simple example of where you could use something like RAG architectures to understand a severity of an issue. So for instance, let's just take for an example of what we just talked about, right? You deploy a mission critical system and, you know, what's the impact of that system going wrong? You know, what do you have to do when that system goes wrong? Now, Jason outperforms me on most things, but Jason would say every time he writes an output, he generates an output, he also does some root cause analysis. What happens if this fails? What impact does this have on the business? How critical is this? And he goes through all this chain, even to the point where he says, what's the code that I need to implement in this system to resolve it? And who should I speak to on the team who's just checked this code in? You know, he's going through 9 steps ahead of trying to predict what's going to happen with these systems as they evolve. And I can't think that far ahead. I literally could think through lunch, maybe. But all this information, all this historical information, all these change management systems, these are hugely complex systems. And that's where Databricks, data lake architectures, and all these different other platforms really do help bring this stuff to life, because you don't want to build an implementation of a graph database. You want something else which is better at doing it to do it for you. And of course, there's so many different flavors, there's so many different variants, but the reason I like Databricks is you can take it offline, you can run it in your own environments. We don't actually use Data Lakehouse, but we copy the architecture for some of our versioning control and graph database technology. So anyway, really not that interesting, that bit. But so let me get you on to something a bit more interesting, right? We came here to kind of, I'm not going to say argue because that would be the wrong term, but to discuss this idea of agentic AI and, is it really the next big thing, right? And, I spoke to some of you and I kind of said, I'm genuinely excited about this, but the technology isn't designed to do what we do. The technology is designed for AI workforce replacement. It's designed to remove people who are doing repetitive tasks that are highly repeatable and should not exist. That's the 212 years spent reading email, right? That's that example. Now, I wasn't going to give this example, but it was something we talked about over at lunch. So if we go back exactly a million days from today, so a million days, by the way, if you want to calculate that on your calculator, that's 440 BC, right? So what happened in 440 BC? 440, yep, that's the right one. Well, I said it before, but, Poseidon's temple was built, right? How many DevOps engineers were building that temple? You can all write the numbers down right here. How many enterprise architects were on that gig? I'm going to say zero for a second. I know there's probably been some very skilled people do it. But, I had this argument with some of the analysts last week, and I said, we're going back to 440 BC. Because if you wanted a temple building, you'd commission a temple, and the Greeks would do the best job at building a temple, right? And it's still there today, so good work, right? If you went to a company now and said, build me a car or a building, there'd be product lifecycle management tools like DASA systems from Siemens and 3D Experience. There'd be CAD systems, the computer-aided design systems. There'd be complex digital twin systems about creating scenarios of different permutations of structural integrity of the buildings and stuff like that, right? And what have we got? We've got engineers, we've got IT departments, we've got IT systems, we've got all of this stuff that makes this one product. Whereas before, it was reliant on people who knew a craft. They were builders, they were architects. And we're going back to that day where, controversially, I realized I said this afterwards, was you don't need those developers, sorry, they're going to get in the room. You can throw things at me, right? You don't need them anymore, because what you need is humans who know what they want, who are now interacting with incredibly complex systems, who are able to interface with these different systems and go, okay, yeah, I understand that if I build this bridge, it will only last approximately 112 years based on the type of physics that we're using for the materials. Is that acceptable? Yes, okay, I'll go ahead. Part of it is these expert systems have, in essence, removed us and taken us back to 440 BC, which I didn't think you were going to get today. Is like, now we're going back to the Greek kind of foundations, right? Learning them, building maths and all the other foundational stuff that we take for granted. So we've got three components in here. What's agentic AI, which I know the guys covered a little bit earlier. The next one, large action models, the bit what I'm super excited about. then large vision models to finish it off and finish off the day, to hopefully get us into this new mentality that it's not agents. And then I just show an entire slide with the words agent written on every slide, right? And I kind of want to just like Tipex these out, but I'm not going to Tipex them out. And I know that I didn't watch the session, but the guys that were on after me talked about shared memory as part of their example. And what I thought was really interesting about this, because I'm sat there with the analysts and I'm saying to them, look, I've got my engineers, I've got my 70th, the smartest engineers in theory on the planet. Why aren't I the end result for all this? Why isn't it just, you know, why aren't we building the best product? And I'd say that the bit which I haven't done is the coordinate piece, right? And actually it's probably one of the hardest pieces to deal with in this framework. Now, if everyone's supposed to get something out of this and just be able to go home and just solve the problem, but if you go to the GitHub repository under Microsoft called, I apologize, AI-Ops. It isn't AI-Ops. I don't think adding the word ops to anything, it makes it a real thing. Just get very lazy with naming. But AI-Ops is actually an agentic framework model for all of the components that actually make this. And so fair play to Microsoft for A, not naming it properly, and B, actually putting the hard work in to get all this stuff working. But actually, it's not a bad repo to actually download. So what they do in AI-Ops is they've got the coordinate bit, what I'm going to call for a second command and control, to actually coordinate the non-agents, the agentic endpoints, and also deal with the shared memory problem. Now, you see in the top right-hand corner, we could say, oh, well, just stick Microsoft Graph there for the knowledge graph. Think about your vector stores, your traditional you know, they've got all those business context bits because they're, you know, they do that, they're Microsoft, right? They have all of your information. But we've already said it's not just your business context. We've said it's your industry context. It's your specific domain expertise, which also needs to augment this, right? Microsoft, I know because I've worked there, and I was responsible for the team to do coded UI, which nobody uses and is end of life, but also their Microsoft Test Manager product, which was built in Silverlight. Thank you for no one laughing when I say Silverlight in public. It used to be Flash, but now Silverlight's a gone thing in the past. But they didn't care about testing, right? They aren't a testing company. They don't want to do QA. And they've end-of-lifed all their products, which were testing products. Even the performance tools are gone, right? Which weren't actually too bad. But part of it is you need to know how to test, develop, project manage, value stream manage, whatever you want to call it. You need to have all of the disciplines that are part of the SDLC. But spoiler alert, it's not just the SDLC, right? IT, the Office of IT, who are building, you know, PLM systems, who are dealing with all the CAD systems, with the manufacturing process systems, the robotic systems, the RF testing of 6G waveforms, all of that stuff needs to be able to be coordinated by a centralized system that can, you know, in essence, talk between ServiceNow and your core banking platforms and your legacy mainframe systems and all the other stuff, right? And that's the dream. The dream is to be able to take over the connected environment. And then I said before, you know, they wanted to be able to get to recall, they wanted to get to large action models so that they can drive your applications, which no person's ever seen on the planet because it's inside of your environment. So this very simple blueprint that turned into the blueprint that you saw on my previous slide, on my keynote this morning, even though when you look at this and you think, that's a lot of stuff to do, and you could be lazy, right? You could just go, well, that's ML flow. I'll just grab that, drop that down, ML flow, done. You know, we had ML flow. The thing kept on crashing in an Iron Bank container, and we went, we'll write our own, it's much better, right? You know, part of it is, you know, toxicity, fluidity, all that kind of stuff's easy enough for you to do on your own. However, some of this other stuff isn't actually that easy to do, because as soon as you get to, using the word agents again, but once you start getting to the point where you have to drive an interface, you know, we've, you know, spent the last 20 years in computer vision landscape. And a few of the people who came over to me earlier, they were like, oh, he said something about Microsoft. They started talking about HoloLens, right? And so I was responsible. I was part of the HoloLens team. And they went, oh, well, the HoloLens is dead. I was like, well, it's not dead. It's now an ITAR-regulated military device where the people on the ground, they put the headset on, they can see through walls because drones are scanning the GIS information and giving them real-time information. When they're driving a tank, they can see everything automatically targeted, and they see through it. When they're in the jets, it wasn't in Top Gun, so Tom Cruise didn't get it, but you could see through the floor. It auto-tracks in pretty much near real-time tracking of enemy aircraft and takes them out. They're running capabilities using XR because Zuckerberg found a new toy called Llama, or whatever it was, and dropped those Meta headsets, because who forgets that they actually were Facebook and they were harvesting all our data and Cambridge Analytica happened, but they rebranded to Meta and talked about the metaverse for a few years. Part of it is it's more complicated than that. You have to be able to deal with incredibly complex systems, battlefield systems, networks. There's a lot more to it than just a UI. And I've been trying to do this probably since the 90s when I started. I've spent 4 decades trying to tell people it's not what you see, right? Just because you can see an interface doesn't mean that's the whole picture. There's so much complexity underneath it. All the good old days of the TIBCO ESBs for Enterprise Service Bus, which has been replaced by Kafka and consumers and producers, all that's disappeared. We just see the front-end data visualization of, in this piece, JP Morgan's internal system, right? But over here on the left-hand side, which is Claude computer use, which anyone can use here today, sits in Bedrock. Claude computer use, and for those keen-eyed people on here, you probably would have saw at the start, it says it's running in localhost because you can deploy it locally. The stuff on the right-hand side, which was the joke that Sam sent out, which was, oh yeah, we can use Selenium. Oh, well done. That's literally like going back to the noughties or something. He's like, WebDriver is old school way of capabilities, but what you will see from this demo is that it's using the computer vision and the reckoning capability, and it's looking at, looking for a search box, right? But if there's 2 search boxes, contextually it doesn't understand. It looks at it, uses YOLO. YOLO gives it, in essence, an XML schema, an XML list of objects that it's identified, and then it will type it, which is why this demo doesn't work very well. It'll get in loop because it can't see this search bar, the search item embedded within another frame. Now, you might have said, well, Jonathan, you just showed us that you have to pass the DOM elements. And the answer is no, you shouldn't really need to pass the DOM elements for this to succeed as well. It should be able to reckon that if I get the wrong response from the first time, the second time I'll try another combination. And that's the reasoning engine, which works really quite well with these guys. Now, again, someone grabbed me at the break and said, well, I want a 200B, when I grow up, I want a 200B DeepSeek. And I was like, well, you don't really want a 200B DeepSeek because the model doesn't actually perform that well. It does for the Chinese market, right? And whenever this was, the 26th of January when it came out, I was partially excited. Sorry, wrong clip. I love when videos don't start, but never mind. But what was really interesting here was just like you saw on the Anthropic, is it goes through that thought process of, okay, so how am I going to solve this problem? How am I going to drive the screen? How am I going to identify objects on that screen? And a good friend of mine who was the old CTO of Source Labs, which was a device farm company back in whenever it was, what they've been doing is they've been sticking Raspberry Pis with this chip, isn't the right chip, but underneath this chip there's an MPU. So whenever someone says, I've got DeepSeek running on a Raspberry Pi, like this Brian, whatever his name is, yes, it is running on a Raspberry Pi, but it's using an MPU, which actually costs more than an actual laptop. So it's a bit cheaty anyway when you say you can run it on a Raspberry Pi. But I did say to the guys during the lunch thing was like, well, actually, The NVIDIA equivalent of this, which they released last year, back end of last year, and I suddenly bought a whole stack of them, was, if anyone's used the NVIDIA devices, the little NPUs, they have an SDK that sits on them with a really, really powerful vision engine. And they are designed to be built into robotics, right? They're not really designed to run large action models and large vision models and large language models, but they do because they're incredibly powerful small devices, about 300 euros. So it's not like it's going to break the bank to get one of these devices, but you could take one and build in, play at home, and have a little go on this. And actually, the NVIDIA ones are incredibly good. The SDK is really good, and it also abstracts a lot of that. I need to learn to use YOLO. I need to use different vision models, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, just because I want to get everyone excited halfway through the day, or partially through the day, I thought, well, I'll put my normal slide. Now, actually, this slide is a year old. That's aging me quite badly. But I don't think the video is going to play. But what you see here is it's actually playing. It's just not playing the top one, right? Is what you're seeing here is this is the early version. If some people have probably seen this already. This is the early version of the Microsoft framework, right? What I talked about with Taylor Swift. And I usually run this when I've got my laptop. I literally run it in front of people. And I go, okay, what are we going to drive? Are we going to drive Spotify? Do you want to launch an application that I have on my desktop or a thick client or something like that? But what really you're seeing, and obviously it's not really a workshop because we're not really doing it, but I will show you OmniParser later. What you're seeing here on the right-hand side is that same thing I said before, is that it's launching the application and then doing object identification to work out, is it in Notepad? Am I in Spotify? Where am I? What am I doing? Now, I mentioned the word late retrieval mechanism, and I'm going to bastardize it for a second, not use the right context. But if I'm on a Spotify application, of course, I want the RAG information to come across, which is, like I said, all the Reddit posts, all the help posts, all the document repositories, even maybe the code base if you got really bored. You want to pull all the contextual information at that particular moment of time. Now, you could potentially argue and say, well, wait a second, Jonathan. If I'm going to use a new app for JRX 180 JBL speakers, right? I don't know anything about speakers. I don't, literally. If someone said to me, buy a Sonos soundbar, I'd say, why? I've got earphones. Why do I need to buy it? But if I wanted to go and get the specs off this, I could go onto the net. I could start scraping, which is what this stuff on the top is. I could start scraping off information from JBL's website, from whatever variants I can do. When I'm stuck on a problem, which is like, okay, this has got an audio issue, which only happens when I stand closer to this field, and somewhere, maybe in the FAQ, if anyone ever wrote an FAQ, it will say, don't put your microphone within 10 yards, and it could make a decision to then inform me at that point in time that I need to turn off the microphone whenever that speaker walks close in proximity of the speaker. Now, obviously, that's quite an extreme sense of it, but the whole point is you don't need populated information into the graph or the RAG. You can do some of these activities in runtime. Now, you could also say to me, what, like I just go to Pi Auto Crawler or something and just scrape all these websites? Yeah, if you want to. You can literally go to cursor.com and it'll give you the code to go off and pull some information off whatever website you want to do, or transform any data structure as you want. You might stick Hotjar in your applications if you're really that excited and start monitoring what your end users are doing, or use open telemetry to reverse engineer every interaction that they're doing, how long they hover over an icon, and then start building a headless browser proxy to recreate that and then learn on those images to then train on user behavior. I don't know what you're going to do. Literally, the answer is, I don't. But what I do know that you're doing is this, right? Is the only thing you should do for the end of today is this. And I pick on the guy on the front row because he spoke. Actually, didn't. We went out. You were stood with me when we were talking over lunch. So what is neo-symbolic programming? I'm only joking. You don't have to answer, right? So Neo-symbolic programming is an abstraction level language, right? It is literally, makes me feel like my Occam days, what I talked about earlier, or basic days are actually coming back. Is you just have to explain it in a mission format to say, I want you to use, I think that's called GIMP, which is not a good name for a graphics editing program, by the way. But you know, and again, context is king. If you'd say, I want to use GIMP, you know, it may get the wrong thing if you use large language models. But you see there, it's using GIMP, right? Part of it is it could go through and learn all of the functions that it needs to do, but I don't need to tell it to do transparency. I just use, in layman's term, please remove the background off this image. I don't care that it's called layers in Photoshop or PaintShop Pro or something else. I can just say to it in a neo-symbolic programming language, say, remove the background off image. That's it. And it can go through and it can do it 9 out of 10 times. It can load Adobe's educational version and give me a 30-day trial and then spin it up on a VM and then delete it afterwards. I do pay for Adobe, by the way, so I don't feel too bad. But if you go on the student version, it's only £20 a month, by the way. Not trying to sell Adobe here. But ironically, Adobe are one of the first ones to actually build Copilot plus functionality, because obviously it makes sense. If you can drive a product, then it just becomes seamless. And of course, Microsoft want that because they want you to not use Notepad, which is the most powerful application on the planet. They want you to use Notepad++ or something like that, right? So anyway, you know, part of this is this architecture still holds true. And what Sam's still trying to do is that right-hand side. He wants to learn from real world. He wants to use recall to observe what people are doing so that it can get better at driving application estates through computer use agents, which I call computer use automation because I don't like the word agent, as you're probably realizing by now, right? So I joked, and this slide's probably as old as I am as well, but I joked about the fact that large, and it literally says it there, large agentic models, which shows you how quickly this thing goes out of date. Large action models were really quite exciting. You know, I got kind of, like I said, I saw a glimpse of it. I knew these things were going to drop. In a way, I'm a bit upset because I kind of wanted to be at this event saying to you, not just the next slide, which will show you Omniparser. I didn't want to, you know, be at this situation. I wanted to literally say, this is all ready to go. And it's going to be, by the end of this year, I'm going to come back, not to here, but I'm going to come back and I'm going to literally go, this has moved on so fast because I know, but I don't know what Microsoft and Sam are going to drop. I don't know how much they're going to expose this year, but I know, based on what I'm seeing, that actually this is going to go so quick that actually most of us will go, Jonathan, you're just talking about RPA. And I'll go, well, you know, I was chatting with the UiPath guys. Anyone been to UiPath recently? Well, if you go, it says the world's largest agentic AI company. It doesn't say RPA on the website anymore. So even when you scrape, you know, the old, because the products are still the same thing, you know, they used to be called RPA. Well, actually, last year they were called hyper-automation tools. This year they're called agentic AI tools. Is it just a fad? Is it just an RPA, just rebadged as an agentic AI platform? I don't know, but I expect this stuff will get so much better. And you can look on the left-hand side and go, well, nothing there is exciting me, Jonathan, right? But well, my name's Wright, so that quite worked out okay. So, you know, part of it is, well, how do we do this? How do we do what Sam dropped on us and showed us? And obviously, he threw operator out, and he said, anyone got $2,000 bucks? I was like, actually, I do have $2,000 bucks, so I'll buy a license. And I bought a license, and I went on. Obviously, I'm based in the Valley, so I could, it's obviously, most people here have a VPN anyway, so they can pretend they're in Silicon Valley. And yeah, if you want to get around it, just set up a PayPal account and pretend that you also have a registered address in the US, and then eventually you can get access to it, but you still need $2,000. Actually, it's not worth $2,000, right? It's probably not worth $20. And of course, you know, if we were doing a hands-on thing, we would just download this code repository called Open Operator, right? And again, I don't work for these guys. None of these tools, which I've said, are anything to do with me. But what you'll see is these guys, on the same day as Operator was launched, said, well, we can do that. You can have it for free. And so if you go to Operator, you could go on it on your laptop now, because I do see people with laptops, which is always nice. If you go to operator.browserbase.com and you just then type in anything, of course, you've got the wisdom now from this morning's session that the better you are, not the better you are at prompting, but the better you are at neosymbolic programming, the better this thing will work with its reasoning engine, right? So, of course, I would ask a question like navigate to Keysight's website and search for my team, which is, I think, quality software quality engineering. Okay. Not a bad prompt, in all fairness. I say prompt, symbolic language. And of course, off we go, and I've realized this isn't the redacted people, so please, I'm going to have to stand here with my head just about here, which is where my price of my product will come up in a second, so it's not supposed to see that, right? It's supposed to be an internal thing only, right? But, you know, as I walk away, you know, I can do discount, and I can do Vimo or whatever it is anyway. So, but anyway, part of it is this system will use reckoning. It will go through, it'll reason it out. For those who were keen-eyed and weren't just looking at me in the corner, you'll realize that it dealt with pop-ups, it worked out how to navigate, it went through and did all that activities, and I joked, because I used to live next to a guy called Vinnie Jones, who was in Gone in 60 Seconds. I kind of showed this to our execs. I said, well, you can do this in less than 60 seconds, and for the people on the laptop over there who are actually doing it, you know, what you will realize, it's slow. It is so slow, because actually, this capability, which I'll go back to the previous slide, this capability is super slow because it's doing so many transactions and YOLO and all this other stuff in the background that actually each decision it's making, even with that beautiful 200 billion or that AI infrastructure or that NVIDIA Edge ML device, it's still going to take too long. And this is the problem what I've already been given about this, is they're saying, well, Jonathan, you say you can build this, you can build it, but it takes 30 seconds between each transaction because it's going off, it's scraping stuff, it's learning stuff, it's building graphs, it's doing all this stuff, and it's got 97% accuracy. We want it to be quicker. And I'm like, I don't do fast, as you can probably see from my build, is I do slow and I do comfortable, right? And so, you know, part of it is this technology is exponential. It will grow. It will become much quicker. It will become much more accurate. And it will be a battle at the end who, you know, once, you know, Zuckerberg decides that he wants to do this because he wants to keep up with the Kardashians, you know, they'll all come after it, right? And of course, I joke, I've said a number of times, minus getting my youngest thrown out of college, you know, Cursor, if you're not using cursor.com, there's a question that happens straight away, right? Everyone use cursor.com here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 people. Anyone pay for GitHub Copilot? Nearly the same, 7 people. You guys have been ripped off. No, I'm joking. No, the GitHub Copilot stuff is bad, right? And by the way, the GitHub Copilot free version, by the way, I'm obviously ex-Microsoft, I shouldn't say this, is actually, I'm going to use the word illegal, but it's not EU AI compliant. So yes, if you pay for the $70 per developer every month, Copilot's okay, may as well just download cursor.com and use that, right? Anyway, so our friend cursor.com, and like I said, last week when I was in Rotterdam, I was literally saying to my 17-year-old, yeah, just press Control-K, okay? And it doesn't matter what you do here, you know, it doesn't matter if it's Python, it doesn't matter if you're passing it, you know, XAML scripts for build pipeline, whatever it is. And I know the next guy coming on stage who's going to give you something really actually interesting from MongoDB. You know, if you want to define a schema registry, or I don't know what you want to do if you're using NoSQL these days. I kind of stopped using databases. But whatever it needs, it will just go off and do. Here's the bash commands. Here's what you need to get installed. You know, this is what you need to do. It just does it, right? And of course, everyone's spotting that it's running Sonnet and it's running 3.7. which is fine. Of course, if you pay for it, there's a better version of the Sonnet 3.7 code, which is a paid version. It is much better, but still not that interesting. The next thing, obviously, I bored people earlier on around saying Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and talked too much about this universal language translation stuff. My engineers kind of got stuck on this for maybe a bit too long about the fact that it has to be Python. And I kind of said to them, I was like, I get it, but why can't it be everything, right? And for those people who I know put their hands up earlier with the Kaggle stuff, is you can use a notebook and run things in Markdown, Java, whatever language, whatever thing you want to do. It doesn't really matter, the language. It's a runtime decision. I use the word a runtime decision quite lightly. But I also believe that it's not just a one-directional thing, and I'm not a one-direction fan, but part of it is it's about informing these systems, going backwards and forwards, that actually code is great. I sat down with Zoe last week from DiffBlue. DiffBlue's a unique code coverage tool which generates all of your code coverage if you've got a Java application. And I know the guys from Oxford Cambridge who put it together, it's actually Oxford who put it together. It's great, right? So you go from 0 code coverage in SonarQube to 100. You go, well, that's just code. That's just code generation, Jonathan. It's boring. But actually, a lot of this stuff works. And as soon as you get down to this lower level and you start feeding it in code bases, I joked, but actually it was true. Someone passed me some COBOL Turbo stuff from a financial system last week and said, can you create a model out of this and tell us about what the system does and how do we build on it and what needs improving? And I said, yeah, I can. Maybe I shouldn't, but I can. But it doesn't matter where you start in this triangle. Again, we'll skip this slide for a second because I know we're 56 minutes into what's going to be maybe 15 more minutes. So everyone's seen this, right? And I kind of, this stuff felt, I'm not going to say real for a second, but a year, 2 years ago, I got a little bit too excited about large vision models, right? I kind of knew that they were going to be incredibly valuable, and I mentioned the quantum use case of MRI scanners, right, over here. Now, that isn't an MRI scan, by the way. I think no, that's not either. Maybe that's an MRI scan, maybe, I don't know. Anyone here a doctor? I'm not a doctor, so. Of course, a good use case for quantum computing, but for people who haven't been to my workshops before, if you read the research, pigeons are actually much better at recognizing things on MRI scans than humans. And you sat there going, no, that's wrong, Jonathan. It's a myth. And then you get home, you Google it, and then you realize that actually they're just better at pattern recognition, right? If you give them enough images of intersections of people's body, they'll recognize things better than a human will. Okay, I kind of nearly believe it now, Jonathan, but it's a weird use case. There's a lot more weird use cases that I keep on getting told every week, and it just disillusions me. The other one I'm going to share with you, only because we've got 2 minutes, and those guys actually Googled it in real time, is microwaves. So I started my job, and of course I worked for an RF company. So I worked for the people who created the new 6G standard. And so when they said, you're going to a microwave conference, I couldn't be more excited, right? Because I am awesome with a microwave. You give me any dish, I'll warm it up, I'll finish it off, no problems, right? Now, then everyone who didn't chuckle will go, oh, well, Jonathan, microwaves for communication, right? You should know that. You work for an RF company. Yeah, I know that. And then my quantum guys go, you do realize why they invented microwaves, right? You know why they invented microwaves? Don't say to heat your food, because then we're all going to get the. It's to bring people back to life. I said, no, this is stupid. Go home, take a sick day, come back tomorrow. And then again, I don't know, those guys might Google it, but when you finish this event, you go and Google it, you can, I don't recommend this, but you can take a hamster, you've got a hamster, right? Put it in your freezer, bye-bye hamster, leave it in your freezer for about 2 days, 2 or 3 days. then go back into your freezer, open it up, pick the hamster up, put it into your microwave, and it's alive, and it will reproduce. It might be slightly, I'm not saying do this, right? But part of it is that's why that technology was invented. It was invented for a completely different use case than what it's actually used for today. This is the same kind of thing, right? Part of it was vision, YOLO, all of the engines that predecate it are great. You think, well, it's just because it wants to be able to recognize criminals, right? And I've stood on stage when I said I worked for the Pentagon. I worked for a predictive crime platform. And if you do Google the word Jonathon Wright, Minority Report, predictive crime, you will see a picture of me saying, in DC, saying that I, not me personally, we were able to predict 20% of all the crime in DC using this predictive crime algorithm. And this was 15 years ago. And most people are like, Jonathan, you weren't. But we were literally using all the feed data, looking at loitering algorithms, looking at where people were looking, in which direction, if there were restricted areas, behavior, people running cars and not getting out of them, suspicious behavior. We were building that into the model. It was all heavy vision models, right? Someone sent me from last week's conference, they sent me something after saying, oh, McDonald's are now using emotional detection on people's facial reactions to feed into their models to say whether or not they actually delivered the right order based on the facial responses. Okay, it's a use case, right? And this stuff is battle-hardened. It's been going for a disproportionate amount of time. And so normally, I would then say to you at this point in time, but these aren't my full slides, the ones that I will share afterwards, you'd get, if you went on, and so I took a photo this morning of my toilet without a flush, of course, it's going to be able to recognize a toilet, contextually understand that I've got a problem a neo-symbolic problem I'm trying to do, which is flush the toilet, and it will tell me how to solve the problem using the Omni capability. And we saw them all pull their phones out, take a photo. Oh, I'm on stage, I'm having a heart attack, can you talk me down or whatever it is? It'll do that because it looks at you. You can tell by the RGB pixel, they can look at your heart rates. I actually was part of a company that actually started building this technology out where they can use just a standard camera, not with LiDAR, which is on the back, just your facial camera to look at all your vital information just by looking at it. Now, obviously, I lost my AirPods last week going to Rotterdam, and the new AirPods, I'm not going to try to spoil anything because otherwise Tim will punch me in the face. The new AirPod Pros, what I'm waiting for now, and which I'm going to buy, have heart rate monitors in them. Now, the person who created that, who's a friend of mine at Stanford, called Dr. Poppy Crum, she also did a TED Talk. She's a neuroscientist, lecturer at Stanford. Part of it is you can just use that information. You can get so much information from, devices these days, right? I don't know where I'll go with any of this. It's quite funny. But anyway, what you'll see, which is me on a train, worryingly, is what I've done is I've pulled down Omniparser. Now, for those people, minus those two guys who are going, part of it is they'll realize that when they try and download this, it won't work. And I usually say that because Microsoft, I know, do this on purpose, that most of the time, unless you can be bothered to debug it all, you'll realize that it's broken. It isn't broken. All you need to do is just run this command here, and then replace the Microsoft Florence, vision model in one of the original, in one of the config files. It's literally in the root directory. It's not exactly rocket science. And then it'll start working, right? And so what you'll find, even on this laptop, which I take that, it's a Snapdragon XL Pro, so it's actually really powerful. But actually, any device here will run this Omniparser capability, and then, minus if you've got enough memory, which is my kind of pet problem at the moment, is your NPU will only get you so far in here. As you can see, 0%, because it's not designed for that. And these slides are slightly out of date. But what you're getting here, which feels like it's nothing, that you can see it's running on my local thing, and I sent it, this was last week, I sent it to Jason. I said, oh, look, I've just tried to use Omniparser to go onto your website and buy one of your licenses. and it didn't work because it couldn't recognize one of the links or whatever. And he wrote back and said, I don't care. But what you will see is once you get it working, you'll get this. Now, to the naked eye, you would just say to me, Jonathan, this is just YOLO. I don't know why you keep on talking about it, but actually it's not. I said about the fact that context is absolutely critical. With this, when it's doing this categorization, it isn't categorizing objects as this is a drop-down button, this does that. You know, I got into an argument this week with somebody saying, oh yeah, you can use the not dictate, but the audio play to read your Word document. And I was like, okay. I was like, but you do realize the version on the Mac is a different API to the version on the PC, and they run at different speeds, so you can't use that as a benchmark. He was like, okay, which is a tip for anybody, don't own a Mac, right? They're really good for doorsteps, blocking doors, but that's it. But you know, part of it is behind each one of these is a whole stack of logic. So if I want to use, which I'd never use, I want to use voice to actually write a letter like IBM created back in 1993, which is a great technology, by the way. I could press the dictate area, but I know the only way I'm going to drive the dictate function is by passing it a voice. Now, obviously, I'm an AI-ish person, so I'd be like, well, I want to try to auto-generate 16 different versions of different speakers with different regional accents to really test this thing out. And of course, for those keen-eyed of you, you'll go to like runway.ai or some other website, and then you'll give it a sample of your voice, and it will then just speak like you speak. As long as you say, the brown fox jumps over the white hen or whatever it is. You say, read it all out, and it will just turn into you, right? And then you can not turn up to any of your meetings anymore and just pretend to be, you know, sit on a beach in Santorini. No beaches in Santorini, as I've realized. But part of it is, it's more than just identifying objects. It's identifying the context and the semantics behind each one of these. And that's what's interesting about Omniparser, is that actually its recognition is actually a way of classifying objects with intent that allows you to then be able to interact with these things and do more than just understand English United States, and if I drop it down to English United Kingdom or English Jamaican, it's going to get a different dialect highlighted on here. And everyone knows the upsetting thing about Word. I use AMI Pro, so I don't really have this problem. But Word got rid of the thesaurus 2 weeks ago. So it's now been pushed out to different people's regional areas. But if you right-click on something, it doesn't say, oh, you could use these other words, because Copilot's like, no, that's my business. A bit like Wozniak saying, you know, let's ask Siri what time it is, right? Is they've got rid of that because they want to use Copilot to create you better written word than, you know, a thesaurus saying, that makes you sound infinitely smarter. So I know we've kind of had a bit of a journey here. You know, it wasn't quite the hands-on roller coaster of technical news supremacy, shall we say, for the word. But what I wanted you guys to be kind of hopefully take away from this session today is, yes, this technology is not completely there, right? You know, we're not saying Omniparser, we're not saying operator, we're not saying Claude computer use, we're not saying, you know, Microsoft Graph, we're not saying data lakehouse architecture is the way forward. This stuff will change continuously. It has to be interchangeable. You can't just go after one stack. You can't go full whack onto Gemini or full whack into a particular stack. You need to be thinking about this from an abstract position and say, okay, how do I use the right tools? How do I understand how they're going to change? How do I know that actually it's not just using the vision engine to identify objects, it's actually more about understanding how, you know, all of these applications, which some of these look quite proprietary icons, you know, how do these work? And then also knowing, well, if I'm going to be dealing with Salesforce, I need to bring in all the Salesforce stuff. And then, well, if I'm using Salesforce, I may as well go to the API and then find out all the customizations of how you've configured Salesforce, and that the fact that you put order into progress, that actually you've got 6 different states. You need to know all that information to be able to make it more informed, more reliable. And these are the questions that you need to be able to ask and participate in to go beyond just the idea that we can apply a large language model which happens to know how to center something or use a particular style icon. Is the more complex capabilities, minus mail merge, which they still have, and creating labels, are behind the scenes, is what it's doing behind the application front end. So anyway, I want to kind of open up some kind of questions, because I know you've hopefully got a little bit more in the afternoon around. I know the guy from MongoDB now is probably going to give you a bit more insight into agent architecture and how that potentially is going to help. I do love MongoDB, but I will invite the other gentleman on the stage to see if we can take some questions, because I think we're about right time, aren't we? We're not. Look at that. I didn't need a clock. Well, I couldn't have used a clock because Siri doesn't work.
We're
right?
great in time, indeed. We're great in time, and we do have like 5 minutes for questions, for if anyone has any. Oh, there's one.
Well, this is the interesting thing. It's like, I know it's a joke thing, but yeah, I think it's like 3 minutes on medium. I think it's the same setting as chicken, which worries me considerably. But yeah, it is a real fact. Google it later, but do not hold me accountable for that awful bit of knowledge, right? It's probably too much information. But thank you for asking. Any other ones?
All right.
Well, there you go. And enjoy the MongoDB thing. I do like a bit of Mongo.
It's been a ride. All right. Thanks a lot, Jonathan.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Yep.